Hi everyone, I just want to thank Troy for inviting me to speak at the event today. After some fairly interesting conversations recently, Troy asked me to kind of give an overview of a fairly interesting forensic investigation case I worked on recently, where we were able to hugely leverage cloud compute, and in particular cloud GPU, to scale a solution to a fairly complicated problem that allowed us to solve the risk management portion of this big investigation. So I'm going to talk you through some of the technical detail, some of the solutioning that we did, and also just some of the things that we found people were not aware of whilst we were on this investigation case. So I'll start with a short overview of me. My name's Andy Barrett. I'm a VP in the assessment business at Coalfire. I'm also a PFI, which means I get involved in a lot of big credit card data investigations. And Troy's background, previously I've worked with him in the past when he was at the PCI Council. So I've done quite a lot of work that's complicated, large-scale investigatory in the payments ecosystem. I'm also, unfortunately, still one of the longest-standing QSAs in the world. So I'm going to talk you through this case and some of the nuances that we had, and then how we were able to leverage fairly healthy hyperscale compute capabilities to solve some of the problems. And I think this is fairly unique and somewhat interesting. So I wanted to do the bottom line up front. There's a few key takeaways I wanted to kind of talk to here. So the role of cloud was really critical. The ability for us to scale and for us to find ways to solve these challenges, as well as optimize for cost, and then actually scale back costs once we'd realized that the compute tasks were able to solve the problem we had. And then looking at how this became an opportunity, how a crisis was averted, and also how potentially we could use this technology or this capability in the future, and the way potentially other CISOs or CIOs could leverage it, and the way we could help support them in the future. So this is the inevitable bat phone. We call it the Forensic Friday call. As a PFI, we routinely get these calls. There's been a data breach on a Friday, or there's been a data breach that gets reported on a Friday, and we find ourselves in the middle of a panic and an investigation has to begin. Now, in this instance, this was a slightly more nuanced scenario. We've been given a very specific request following a breach and following all the remediation work that had taken place. There's a fairly sizable data set that needed some analysis. And the challenge that we were faced with was that this data set was believed to be encrypted. It turns out that it was hashed, and there's some complexity around the way the hashing was done. But there's some sensitive data in this data set. The problem was the data set was huge. So we were talking millions upon millions of records. And everybody really wanted to know what's the real risk if this data is compromised. How do we resolve, like, what could happen, what could go wrong? And we were looking at potentially sizable amounts of people that could be impacted. And so the client was really concerned. They wanted to do the right thing, and they wanted to try and understand, like, hey, if we have this data and we know it potentially gets into the wrong hands, like, what's the worst that could happen? And so we were presented what seemed like a fairly impossible challenge. The challenge was, like, you've got this data that's either encrypted or hashed with some unknowns. Can you try and recover it, work out what it is, and then try and scale a solution that allows us to recover that data? And then also figure out, like, just what the risk exposure is if this is in the hands of a fraudster. So at Coalfire, we don't like the word impossible. We're always happy to take on a challenge. And in this particular instance, this was kind of our sweet spot. So I was still the lead investigator for this case. Worked with some of the cybersecurity team we have, who are more familiar with offensive security techniques. They typically do penetration testing, ethical hacking, application security on a fairly regular basis. Sat down and worked out, like, a potential use case for, like, how we would recover this data, what we would do. We looked at some of the infrastructure we have for typical red team engagements, the way we would potentially do things like password recovery, and suddenly realized that the capability we had, albeit at a fairly small scale, we could probably repurpose to evaluate some of this data to see if it was recoverable and in a way that would then allow us to do some fairly meaningful analysis. So we started out with a fairly small scale implementation. We took some samples from this data to see if we could reverse engineer it, and it turned out that with the tools and the capabilities that we had, we were relatively quickly able to get to a position where we knew that we could sort of systematically recover this data. The challenge we were faced with was the scale of the data set was huge, and if we couldn't get the recovery per transaction time down to a sub-second, millisecond response time, then we'd be looking at potentially the boundaries of physics to get this resolved. So we decided to kind of move forward with one of our cloud partners, AWS. We looked at what the capabilities they were presenting to us were, and then suddenly we found an opportunity to work with their hyperscale GPU. And this gave us, I think, some fairly phenomenal capability. So very, very quickly we were able to scale up the tooling that we were using. We were working with a product called Hashcat, fairly standard toolkit from a penetration tester's perspective. But now what we've been able to do is scale our base level tooling to fairly significant levels. So at this point we're running AWS X large G13s, I think they were, with GPUs permanently on the go. So we're working through a data set that's fairly vast, but we were able to get to a point where we could start to recover some of this data. So once we kind of decoded the format of the data, we understood the hashing mechanism that was used, the salts that were in play, we were able to build out an appropriate reversing technique. So using Hashcat, the team were able to slowly, initially to begin with, work out what we'd have to do to kind of get this data recovered. And then very quickly we were able to scale this to like the millions upon millions of records that we had in this data set. And at that point we were in a position where we thought we could have something that was manageable. And what we discovered during this process was we were working with multiple fairly senior stakeholders, with our client, the client's law firms, and their data protection officer. And suddenly we're in a position where we can actively say that we can recover this data in a meaningful time frame and start to manage the expectations of all of these executive level stakeholders. And that gave us some significant confidence in upscaling the solution further to see if we could bring the time down. And this was the first time we'd leveraged the scale of cloud GPU that we had, and the results were unbelievable. We were able to bring this data set to an almost complete recovery situation where we could analyze all of the data that was considered at risk. We'd been able to reverse something like 98% of the information, and we were now in a position where we could take what everybody thought was just this hypothetical scenario. Is this hashing algorithm exposed? Were the salts strong enough? Was the data stored in such a way that it could be reversed? And we could put some very meaningful costs associated to that in terms of what an intruder would have to spend, what that would look like in terms of potential return on investment from a threat actor, what they would have to do to monetize this potential data breach, and whether it's likely that they would. So having been able to reverse this, we look back and we find ourselves in a position where this is almost like large-scale money laundering. If you're a threat actor now, with millions upon millions of records, it becomes harder and harder to monetize over time, because you've now got something that really indicates that this threat actor was definitely the person who compromised this data set. So we found ourselves able to evaluate all of the records, what they could be used for, how they could be used fraudulently, and then take that back to all the stakeholders we were working with, who were the data owners, and say, like, we do not think that this could be used for fraud anymore. We're now able to identify when it was last used, what the dates associated with it were, and that gave us some really meaningful telemetry that was able to offset the initial perceived risk from a data breach. And this is only really possible because of the cloud GPU capability that we brought to the table. We had such a vast success rate that we were able to bring our timeframes in. So everybody was looking at the work we were working with, and we were in a position where we could say this was believed to be an impossible challenge, that we were able to scale up with, repeatable tools that are available off the shelf, and a capacity that we're able to manage the cost of over time. And then we're able to provide a solution to the client where, should this happen again, we now have a very workable model that we can scale to in a way that gives very defined outcomes for this recovery process. So that was a really interesting case to be involved with. It's very rare that we get a full data set that is believed to be at risk, let alone have the ability to really validate and test the security controls that have been placed around it, and then work with people who are still concerned, even in an encrypted or hashed state, that the data may be misused by an intruder, and get to a point where we can actively say, look, this is what it would cost in terms of an investment of time, compute, GPU in this case, to recover that data to a workable position. And so one of the things that this really triggered with us was how else this could be useful for like the CISO or the CIO community. And a fairly common discussion point from the team was, we get CIOs or CISOs who inherit infrastructure, and they've inherited databases, they've inherited key management infrastructure. In some cases there are keys or there are hashing algorithms that are no longer available, and data has been kept in data lakes for either analytical purposes or consumer trend management. So there's lots of very viable reasons why this data may be kept in the format it's in. But actually now regulatory requirements are changing, and so the security around that data needs to be increased. We're now in a position where, leveraging the kind of cloud compute and GPU that was available, data could be recovered back to a known clear text state, potentially re-encrypted using more modern methods. So potentially with a well-managed symmetric key infrastructure, or with some asymmetric keys, depending on the scale. And then a CISO can actively take ownership of a data set that previously could have been managed differently or by different executives, and would put him or her in a position where they're able to say, like, hey, I can now apply the appropriate regulatory controls and governance to this data at a huge scale, and this is what the cost of like recovering it was, and this is now a manageable, well-costed process that is executable against pretty defined objectives or timeframes, purely because the reversing tools are now available. But with specific cloud compute powering them, they're able to put more scale and more time management around it. And this then became a fairly active conversation. If there are multiple sets of data breaches where this kind of data is available, we're now able to look at it, I think, more aggressively, and really actively take a view as to whether the encryption scheme or the hashing process is sufficiently robust enough, and we can now use the capabilities that we've got to look at even future states, future regulatory environments, different types of hashing schemas that could be used, different salting dynamics that could be used. Did we need to do big rainbow tables, for instance, to start to look at how we would reverse engineer this? So there's lots of potential that I think we discovered the general populace was unaware of from a technical capability. And one of the biggest surprises was just the lack of knowledge that both cloud compute in a metered, like on-demand sense, and also cloud GPU was available to the general population. Like the number of times we had to explain, like, hey, we can define this cost in a very ring-fenced way through our cloud partner, versus the expectation was that we would, a CapEx investment would have to be made to acquire all this equipment, acquire all these GPUs, do all of this essentially from a standing start. No, we can consume this, and we can consume it in a metered on-demand kind of manner. And so one of the things that this really made us think about was that we probably live in this cloud compute world where we're generally familiar with that, but there are a number of professional circumstances where we were very quickly able to identify people that just were not versed in the technology that's out there. And it was really important we explained to them, hey, this is a metered compute. Like, it sounds really trivial if you're familiar with cloud, you're cloud native, or you've been involved in significant migrations. But we were dealing with relatively senior stakeholders who were unaware that this capability was even a thing, and that was able to be done in a simple metered manner, and that we could price out a solution purely based on the compute resources we used to do that specific task. And that was a real eye opener. I think we usually operate in our own little bubble, and we expect like a degree of experience from the people we're working with, but it was really professionally fascinating to see that senior people in relatively technical and then also in other kind of professional roles were just unaware of this, and we had to go back and explain, like, this is the way the technologies work, this is how we can leverage it, and this is how you get that scale, but also how the cost stops once we've finished. So we had some really fascinating discussions around like using this capability to scale, but also being able to slow down and even take proof of concepts when we saw unusual data structures. We could pause the main environment that we were using to do the decryption, spin up a new instance with some different tools, whilst we test some potentially different algorithms. But we can still leverage the on-demand capabilities and then give them an example if we needed to scale up vertically. So that kind of created some interesting opportunities. The biggest one was just the way we could bring that capability into similar scenarios. So multiple data recovery scenarios were then presented, and also data escrow scenarios where potentially we could use that capability to provide like real-time escrow for compromised data that may be in a unusual format, quickly leverage the availability of the cloud compute to be able to do the reversing of a hash, or potentially the decryption, in a way that gives access to potentially legal professionals or access to a general counsel for review, that would then provide like meaningful defense that somebody was or wasn't impacted by a potential data breach. And that really opened our eyes. So we were able to combine multiple sets of professionals, our capabilities as cybersecurity professionals, as well as like the ability to build our lab environment with just vast amounts of cloud compute and GPU available to us. And so we suddenly started thinking, like, what are the other scenarios that this could be super valuable for, and what else do we think this level of capability could be brought to the table for? And we started to go into all sorts of rabbit holes. Our primary consideration was the data recovery side, but potentially the certification of new systems, certification of data for reuse or re-encryption. That was a pretty common theme that cropped up. But what we really discovered was that there was more opportunity in just helping people to understand that the capability existed in this metered manner. Seemed to be the thing that resonated more than actually the specifics of the capability technically. And that was the biggest surprise. I think we'd come away expecting everybody to have this kind of cloud familiarity, but they at best they knew, like the more technical, like the CIO level, were more aware of the native compute workloads and storage availability, but very few were aware of this ability to attach GPUs at scale as well. And I think that was the surprise from our perspective. So when we were looking at how else would this pan out, we were really open up some discussion with the executives we were dealing with, and we were still surprised. Like there were scenarios where we talked about potential for physics engines to be used, which was kind of interesting, as well as like on-demand AI is the most common use case right now that people are becoming familiar with. But as we were talking about it, I think them being aware that this capability doesn't just have to be for AI, which was the most normal, where people were aware, being able to say, look, this stuff has some significant security usage, particularly when the functions, are available for like hash reversal. There's a few jovial points made about, like, could we run Fortnite in the cloud and let our kids play, as well as the potential upscaling of Bitcoin mining. But the reality was that this really opens up mainly decryption and reversing of hashes to a level that I don't think was ever really considered in the past. I think when we originally looked at the offering without like mass GPU usage, we very quickly looked at, like tens of millions of records could take, years and years to do the reverse engineering of. And yet being able to bring vast amounts of cloud GPU to the table and very quickly scale a solution that can make use of it really changed the dynamics of what was possible, and actually really made us think like we should rethink some of our security solutions, where there is where hashing's a key component, either from a data protection or from a authentication perspective. We really have to consider some of those legacy hashes, the legacy hashing algorithms now as not being robust enough in the event of compromise, where a threat actor's got access to this sort of resource now. So from a data perspective, yes, it meant we could reverse a huge data set, and we looked at, would a threat actor do that, and would they take the time or the investment to do it? And I suspect that there's a maybe situation there. There could be a big payoff, but there's also a lot of risk to the threat actor in doing so. But when we looked at the other use cases, potentially compromising of credentials or reversing of hashes that specifically relate to a password, this could be monetized very, very quickly. And so that capability could be used by our adversaries, but also could be used defensively. So, proactively taking password hashes, being able to run them through a high-scale GPU, using tools like Hashcat is a fairly sensible way of auditing the overall password strength that you might have. But also, it's a very quick way to work out what your exposure is if you suffer an intrusion where lateral movement's fairly likely. Typically, the first thing an attacker will do is they'll try and dump hashes for all your password repositories. And now potentially they could just offload those to large-scale compute with GPU in the cloud, and have very, very rapid turnaround for access to all of your different environments. So it really puts the emphasis on like a zero trust model within your network environment, because potentially there's the capability now to break various security products or certain algorithms that are utilized by them, which potentially changes the way we have to think about defending our critical assets. So yeah, we had quite a lot of interesting discussions. The case itself went on, and I believe ultimately the actual threat actor was arrested, and so some of the data we were able to use was useful from both helping to prove that the intruder had at least stolen that data set, and previously when we've done this, we've not had to go to the sort of scale of the tens and hundreds of millions of records. So it was really fascinating to see like this was meaningful and valuable to the stakeholders in the community that rely on the data, and potentially will have gone some way to help reduce payment fraud in the future, and stop a criminal and organized crime group from taking advantage of a fairly significant number of people. And all of that was really possible at this kind of scale because of the cloud and the cloud GPU capabilities we're able to bring to the table. So I know it's been a fairly whistle-stop tour of a slightly more unusual PFI case. So I'd be more than happy to do any follow-ups with people if you've got interesting questions you want to ask, or you have insights into how you could leverage this kind of capability to help make a more robust data strategy or data security strategy. You can always reach out to me, Andy Barrett at Coalfire, or andrew.barrett@coalfire.com. You can find us on all the usual social channels. So yeah, I just wanted to leave some contact details. If you have any other questions or you want to learn more about how Coalfire could help, feel free to reach out, email or LinkedIn, or come through our contact us on coalfire.com. And yeah, I'd be more than happy to field any other questions through the CSA team. So thanks for joining. Hopefully this time frame has been useful, and the kind of details are of interest. And more than happy to take any other questions in the future.